The fluorescent lights of Parker's Market hummed above me like angry wasps as I scanned another customer's groceries. My fingers moved automatically across the barcode reader. Beep, beep, beep. Each sound marking another moment of my 41 years behind this same register. The red polyester vest clung to my shoulders, faded from countless washes, bearing ghostly outlines of name tags that told stories of promotions that never came. My wedding ring caught the harsh light as I reached for a milk carton. That simple gold band had once meant forever. Now it felt more like a chain, binding me to promises apparently only I intended to keep. The woman in front of me struggled with two screaming toddlers, their voices cutting through the background noise of rattling shopping carts and distant conversations about dinner plans. I offered her a sympathetic smile, the kind that came naturally after 18 years of customer service, when every human emotion had to be filtered through professional courtesy. My earbuds sat quietly in my ears, a small rebellion against corporate policy. Most managers looked the other way as long as I stayed efficient and pleasant. The music usually helped hours pass more quickly, provided a soundtrack to monotony that made each shift feel less like a prison sentence. But today, instead of music, my phone delivered a message that would shatter my world into irreparable pieces. I'm going to find something better. Ryan's voice carried through the wireless signal with devastating clarity, each word precisely enunciated in that tone he used for business matters. No emotion, no suggestion he was discussing our 12-year marriage rather than commenting on the weather. I need someone who matches my future. I'm going to find something better. The words hung in digital space between us, delivered with clinical precision. Not even the dignity of a face-to-face conversation, not even the courtesy of waiting until I came home from work, until we were private, until I could process this earth-shattering announcement without strangers witnessing my destruction. A voice message. While I stood in my workplace, surrounded by customers with their own problems, wearing the uniform that had become my second skin, scanning groceries for people who saw me as nothing more than a necessary step between them and dinner. My hand froze mid-scan, the barcode reader trembling in my fingers while the milk carton blurred before my eyes. The scanner's red laser continued sweeping back and forth, searching for patterns that would translate into prices. But my fingers had gone numb, as if my nervous system decided to shut down, rather than participate in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. I rewound the message once, my thumb fumbling with controls while my other hand maintained its grip on the scanner. Surely I'd misheard something. Surely Ryan, who could be thoughtless and self-centered but had never been deliberately cruel, hadn't actually ended our marriage via voicemail while I was at work. The replay confirmed every devastating word. I tried again, then a third time, hoping the digital recording would change, that reality would reassert itself and reveal this to be some technical error or elaborate prank. But each repetition hammered home the brutal truth. The man I'd loved, supported, and sacrificed for had discarded me with the same casual indifference he might show deleting unwanted emails. The line behind me grew restless. A man in an expensive business suit checked his Rolex with impatient gestures. A teenager with purple hair tapped her foot to music only she could hear. An elderly woman clutched her purse with arthritic fingers, face bearing patient resignation of someone who'd learned complaining about delays only made them feel longer. Life continued its relentless march while my universe collapsed inward, creating a singularity of pain right there in aisle 7, between breakfast cereals and cleaning supplies, where industrial carpet bore stains of countless spilled drinks and fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. Something cracked wide open in my chest. Not my heart, for that implied something clean and sharp, like glass breaking. This was messier, rawer, like old wood splintering under too much weight, the groaning protest of structural beams that had been bearing more than they were designed to handle for far too long. "Ma'am?" The business suit man's voice carried particular irritation, reserved for service workers who had the audacity to experience human emotions during business hours. "Is there a problem?" I looked up at this stranger, whose biggest concern was whether grocery shopping would make him late for whatever important meeting awaited him. I wanted to explain that my husband had just abandoned me via voicemail, that 12 years of marriage had been dismissed in 30 seconds of recorded audio. Instead, I managed a weak smile and resumed scanning his items. Organic vegetables that cost more than I spent on food in a week, imported cheese representing half my daily wage, wine I'd never afford even for special occasions. Each beep felt like a small death, another reminder of the vast gulf between my circumstances and those I served. If you like emotional stories that touch the heart, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here who understand that real life sometimes writes the most powerful stories. And tell me, from which city are you watching? Because no matter where you are, I believe every woman deserves to know she's not alone in her struggles. The rest of my shift passed in mechanical motions and forced pleasantries. I scanned barcodes, counted change, bagged groceries, wished customers pleasant days while my mind replayed Ryan's message on endless loop. The words became a mantra of rejection, a meditation on inadequacy that accompanied every mundane task. I'm going to find something better. Beep. Another can of soup for someone else's dinner. I need someone who matches my future. Beep. Another bottle of wine for someone else's celebration. What I didn't know then, as I stood behind that register feeling my world crumble, was that Ryan's cruelty would be just the beginning. What awaited me at home would reveal the true depth of his betrayal and force me to discover strength I never knew I possessed. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where I'd imagined living someday, past houses with manicured lawns and windows glowing with warm yellow light, suggesting the kind of domestic contentment I'd always assumed would eventually be mine. Every landmark along the familiar route now served as monuments to a life that had apparently been built on foundations of sand. The coffee shop where Ryan and I had our first date, nervously sharing chocolate cake while trying to impress each other with college stories. The park where we'd walked Max on Sunday mornings, throwing tennis balls and pretending to be the kind of couple who had everything figured out. The restaurant where he'd proposed 7 years ago, getting down on one knee beside a table decorated with roses he'd somehow arranged to have waiting. Each memory felt contaminated now, poisoned by the knowledge that while I'd been treasuring these moments as evidence of our love's strength, Ryan had apparently been cataloging my inadequacies and planning his escape. How long had he been thinking about leaving? How many of our conversations had been his way of gathering ammunition for eventual divorce proceedings? The house stood silent when I arrived, but it was a different kind of silence than I'd grown accustomed to over 12 years of marriage. This wasn't the quiet of an empty home waiting to be filled with conversation and laughter. This was the hollowness of a space that had been deliberately emptied, systematically stripped of everything that made it feel like a home, rather than just a building. The front door opened normally, my key turning in the lock, with the same small clicking sound I'd heard thousands of times before. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something fundamental had changed. The air felt different, thinner somehow, as if someone had opened all the windows and let the essence of our shared life escape into the atmosphere. The leather sectional we'd saved for over 2 years, gone. I could see the indentations in the carpet where its legs had rested, small depressions marking the ghost of furniture we'd chosen together during a weekend shopping trip that had felt like such an adult milestone. We'd sat on dozens of couches in the showroom, testing firmness and discussing color options like the decision actually mattered, like we were building something permanent together. The dining room set my parents had given us as a wedding gift vanished completely. The mahogany table where we'd eaten Christmas dinners and celebrated birthdays, where I'd paid bills and he'd worked on his laptop during evenings when the office followed him home, now existed only as a slightly lighter rectangle on the hardwood floor, where years of sunlight hadn't been able to reach. Even the coffee table I'd refinished myself during a long weekend project had disappeared. I'd spent hours sanding away years of wear and water stains, revealing beautiful wood grain beneath layers of neglect. I'd researched proper techniques, bought the right supplies, worked until my arms ached and my back protested from bending over for hours. When I'd finally applied the final coat of polyurethane and stepped back to admire my work, Ryan had nodded approvingly and said it looked almost professional. The walls bore pale rectangles where pictures had hung, photographs from our honeymoon, framed prints we'd bought at art fairs, even the silly snapshot of us at a Halloween party 3 years ago when we'd dressed as matching playing cards. These ghostly marks served as an inventory of shared memories that had apparently meant more to me than to him, evidence of a life together that he'd been able to discard as easily as outdated calendar pages. In the bedroom, Ryan's walk-in closet yawned empty, the wooden hangers swaying slightly in the current from the air conditioning vent, like the remnants of a forest after a wildfire had swept through and consumed everything combustible. The built-in shelving that had once held his shoes and accessories now displayed only dust outlines and the occasional forgotten sock or tie clip that hadn't been deemed worthy of inclusion in his new life. My own clothes seemed lost and lonely on their side of the shared space, a visual representation of how I'd felt for months without consciously acknowledging it. Dresses hung with extra space between them now that his suits no longer pressed against them. My shoes looked scattered and insufficient on shelves that had once been perfectly organized to accommodate two people's footwear collections. The dresser drawers hung open, their contents ransacked and abandoned with the haste of someone who'd wanted to complete an unpleasant task as quickly as possible. His cologne bottles and grooming supplies had disappeared completely, leaving only the faint scent of his presence slowly fading into memory, mixing with the smell of furniture polish and the lavender sachets I'd tucked into corners to keep our clothes smelling fresh. But the cruelest discovery waited in the kitchen. The savings account, our joint account that I'd foolishly trusted him to manage because he was better with numbers and understood investment strategies I'd never had the education to master, had been drained to the last dollar. Years of my careful contributions, every $20 and $50 bill I'd managed to squirrel away from modest paychecks, all gone. The online banking statement showed a balance of $0.00, with a final withdrawal that had cleared that morning while I was scanning groceries and smiling at customers who were planning dinners I could no longer afford to cook. He'd systematically removed himself from our financial obligations while allowing me to remain ignorant of the approaching disaster. Even Max was gone. Our golden retriever, who'd been my constant companion through long shifts and difficult days, who'd greeted me at the door every evening with the kind of unconditional enthusiasm that made minimum wage work feel bearable, had been taken along with everything else Ryan had decided belonged to him. I found Max's leash hanging forgotten on the kitchen hook, a detail so small yet so devastating that it finally broke through my shock and brought the tears I'd been holding back since that first replay of the voicemail. The leash was red nylon with reflective stitching, chosen specifically for our evening walks through the neighborhood when visibility mattered for safety. Max had learned to recognize the sound of me taking it down from its hook, the small metallic clink that meant adventure was imminent. He'd dance around my feet while I attached it to his collar, his tail creating a percussion rhythm against furniture and walls. His joy so pure and simple that it had never failed to lift my spirits even on the worst days. Now the leash hung limp and purposeless, a reminder of companionship that had been severed as cleanly as everything else in my life. Ryan had taken Max not because he particularly enjoyed dog ownership. I'd been the one who fed him, walked him, cleaned up after him, and arranged for veterinary care, but because Max was an asset with monetary value, something that could be claimed and possessed and removed from my reach. That night, hunger drove me to the kitchen, where I discovered the final insult: 1 egg, half a bottle of ketchup, and a slice of stale bread. This was my inheritance from 12 years of marriage, the scraps left behind by a man who'd taken everything he deemed valuable and left me with the remnants. I cracked the egg into a pan that had seen better days, its non-stick coating worn away in patches that made cooking a small act of faith. I ate my meager dinner standing at the counter, too drained to sit at the kitchen table where Ryan and I had shared thousands of meals. Too numb to cry over the irony that I, who had fed others for so many years, now found myself with barely enough food to sustain myself. Outside my kitchen window, the neighborhood continued its evening routine. Dogs barking as their owners returned from work, children playing in backyards while parents prepared dinners, families gathering around tables laden with abundance I could no longer afford. The sounds of normal life drifted through the glass, reminding me that somewhere, people were still living the kind of existence I'd once taken for granted. But I was no longer part of that world. In the span of one voicemail and one devastating homecoming, I'd been expelled from the life I'd spent 12 years building. Sleep came fitfully that night on the bare mattress Ryan had apparently deemed unworthy of theft. The bed frame remained, but the expensive memory foam mattress that had been his contribution to our bedroom comfort had vanished along with everything else. I was left with the basic box spring and the thin backup mattress we'd kept in the guest room, a surface designed for occasional use rather than nightly rest. I curled into myself beneath a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender fabric softener, pulling my knees to my chest in the fetal position that humans instinctively adopt when the world becomes too overwhelming to face upright. Every sound in the settling house made me jump. Was he coming back? Had he forgotten something else he wanted to claim as his own? But Ryan didn't return, and as the hours passed in darkness, I began to understand with crystalline clarity that he never would. The voice message had been his goodbye, his dismissal, his final judgment on a woman he'd decided was insufficient for the future he envisioned for himself. 2 days later, when I'd begun to adjust to the hollow echo of my own footsteps in a house designed for 2 people, the phone rang with news that sent my world spinning further into chaos. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and utterly without sympathy. A bank representative calling about the mortgage payment that was apparently now 3 months overdue. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Jennifer Walsh from First National Bank," the woman said, her tone suggesting this was merely another item to check off her daily list of unpleasant conversations. "We've been trying to reach you regarding your mortgage account. According to our records, payments stopped in January, and we need to discuss your options immediately." I stared at the phone, certain there had been some mistake. Ryan handled our finances with the methodical precision he brought to his professional work, managing our accounts and investments while I focused on what he called the day-to-day stuff: groceries, utilities, the mundane expenses that kept our household functioning but didn't require sophisticated financial knowledge. "There must be some confusion," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "My husband handles our mortgage payments. He sets up automatic transfers from our account every month. According to our records, Mr. Morrison contacted us 3 months ago to remove his automatic payment authorization," Jennifer Walsh continued, her voice remaining neutral but somehow conveying the implied criticism that had become familiar to anyone who'd ever fallen behind on financial obligations. "He indicated that you would be taking over responsibility for the account going forward." The words hit me like physical blows. Ryan had been planning his departure for months, systematically removing himself from our financial obligations while allowing me to remain ignorant of the approaching disaster. What kind of wife didn't know her own husband had stopped paying their mortgage? What kind of adult allowed someone else to manage such fundamental aspects of their financial life without maintaining any oversight? "I don't understand," I stammered, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs Ryan had deemed unworthy of relocation. "I wasn't told about any changes. I don't have access to the mortgage information. Everything is in his name." "That's correct," the bank representative confirmed with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation countless times. "Mr. Morrison is the primary account holder, which means he has the authority to make changes without requiring your signature or consent. However, since you're listed as residing at the property, we're required to notify you of any pending legal action." Legal action. The phrase hung in the air like a death sentence, formal and final, and utterly beyond my ability to appeal or reverse. I'd become the victim of laws designed to protect property rights and loan security, regulations that prioritized the bank's interests over the human casualties created when marriages dissolved, and financial responsibilities shifted without warning. "We'll need to see some kind of payment within the next 10 days, Jennifer Walsh continued, "or we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings. The amount due, including late fees and penalties, is $18,437. $18,000. More than my entire annual salary after taxes. More money than I'd ever had access to at one time in my adult life." The number hung in the air like a mathematical impossibility, a figure so far beyond my means that it might as well have been 18 million. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my empty kitchen and tried to calculate whether $18,000 was an achievable goal under any conceivable circumstances. If I could find another job immediately, if I could work 80 hours a week, if I could eliminate every expense beyond basic survival needs, even then, the mathematics of poverty made the bank's demands impossible to satisfy. A week later, as if the universe had decided my suffering wasn't quite complete, an official-looking envelope appeared in my mailbox bearing the seal of the county court. Inside, documents printed on expensive paper and written in deliberately intimidating legal terminology informed me that I had 30 days to vacate the premises or face forced removal by law enforcement. Eviction. The word itself felt shameful, carrying connotations of failure and irresponsibility that I'd never associated with my own life. I'd always paid my bills, met my obligations, lived within my means with the careful attention to detail that people of limited resources learn to exercise as a matter of survival. Yet here I was, facing homelessness through no fault of my own. I read the documents 3 times, hoping to find some loophole, some avenue of appeal, some way to prove that this was all a terrible mistake. But the law was clear and unforgiving. When your name isn't on the deed and you can't make the payments, your residency becomes a privilege that can be revoked with proper legal notice. The final blow came the following Monday morning, when I arrived at Parker's Market for what I assumed would be another routine day of scanning barcodes and forcing smiles for customers who saw me as nothing more than a necessary inconvenience. Instead, I found myself called into the manager's office, a cramped space behind the customer service counter that smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant, furnished with aggressively uncomfortable chairs that discouraged employees from lingering during what were inevitably unpleasant conversations. Margaret Chen had been my supervisor for 8 years, a practical woman in her 50s who ran the store with the efficiency of someone who understood that retail success depended on maintaining precise control over labor costs. She was fair, but never particularly warm, treating her employees with professional courtesy that made difficult decisions less complicated for everyone involved. "Sit down, Becky," Margaret said, gesturing to the metal folding chair positioned across from her desk, at precisely the distance that corporate consultants had determined was optimal for delivering unwelcome news. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," Margaret continued, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd delivered this speech too many times over the years. "We're downsizing. Corporate has decided to eliminate several full-time positions across all locations as part of a chain-wide cost reduction initiative. Since you've been here the longest, your severance package will be more substantial than what newer employees receive, but I'm afraid your position is being eliminated effective immediately." The words hit me like physical blows. 18 years of loyal service, of showing up early and staying late, of covering shifts for sick colleagues and working through holidays when other people were home with their families, all of it reduced to a corporate decision made by people in offices hundreds of miles away who'd never learned my name. "Your final paycheck will include 2 weeks' severance pay," Margaret continued, sliding an envelope across the desk with mechanical precision. "I want you to know that this decision came from levels far above my authority. If it were up to me, you'd be the last person I'd ever consider letting go. 2 weeks' pay, $468 after taxes, barely enough to buy groceries for a month under normal circumstances, let alone enough to secure new housing and survive until I could find another job in an economy where employers increasingly preferred younger workers who would accept lower wages." I took the envelope with hands that had somehow stopped shaking, my body's shock response finally exhausted by the relentless succession of disasters. The envelope felt thin and insubstantial, inadequate compensation for nearly 2 decades of labor, for the arthritis in my knees from standing on concrete floors, for the permanent smile lines around my eyes from maintaining cheerfulness through countless difficult interactions. I cleaned out my locker in the employee break room, gathering the few personal items I'd accumulated over nearly 2 decades. A photo of Ryan and me from happier times, a small succulent plant that had somehow survived under fluorescent lights, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle that I'd grown fond of despite its imperfection. These meager possessions fit easily into a single plastic bag, a tangible representation of how little I'd allowed myself to accumulate in a workplace where I'd spent most of my adult life. The other employees avoided eye contact as I walked through the store for the last time, their discomfort palpable in the way they suddenly found urgent tasks that required their complete attention. They understood, with the intuitive wisdom of people who lived paycheck to paycheck, that acknowledging my situation too directly might somehow make them more susceptible to the same fate. Outside, the parking lot stretched before me like a desert of hot asphalt and abandoned shopping carts, heat waves rising from the pavement in the late afternoon sun. My Honda Civic sat in the employee section where I'd parked it thousands of times before, faithful and unpretentious, the only thing in my life that hadn't betrayed or abandoned me when circumstances became difficult. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the store that had defined my identity for 18 years, wondering who I was supposed to be now that everything I'd thought permanent had proven ephemeral. The building looked the same as always. Red brick facade, large windows displaying weekly specials, automatic doors that opened and closed with mechanical regularity as customers entered and exited with their purchases. But I was no longer part of that routine, no longer one of the people who made the system function. I'd been expelled from the economic ecosystem that had sustained me, cast out into a world where my experience and dedication apparently counted for nothing against the mathematics of profit margins and cost reduction initiatives. The car became my refuge when the eviction notice expired, and the sheriff's deputies arrived to oversee my removal from the house I'd called home for over a decade. They were professional but firm, explaining with practiced sympathy that I could take only what I could carry, and that any remaining possessions would be disposed of according to state law. I packed what fit in my car with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd never had to prioritize possessions before, choosing between items that all seemed essential until forced scarcity demanded impossible decisions. Some clothes, but not all. I kept work-appropriate outfits and weather-appropriate layers while abandoning everything else. A few books that had provided comfort during difficult times. The photo albums Ryan had deemed unworthy of theft, filled with images of relatives who'd passed away and friends who'd drifted out of contact. Everything else. The dishes my grandmother had given me as a wedding gift, each piece wrapped in tissue paper and presented with stories about the meals they'd served. The furniture I'd saved for months to buy, choosing each piece carefully from thrift stores and clearance sales. The accumulated artifacts of a life lived in one place for over a decade became someone else's problem to solve. That first night in the car, parked behind a 24-hour laundromat where the security lights provided a measure of safety, and the constant hum of industrial washers and dryers masked the sound of my crying, I discovered depths of despair I hadn't known existed. The backseat of a Honda Civic wasn't designed for human habitation, and my 5'6" frame couldn't find any position that didn't result in cramped muscles and aching joints. I used my winter coat as a blanket, its down-filling providing some insulation against the cool night air that seemed to seep through the car's windows despite their closed positions. My rolled-up sweater served as a pillow, though it offered little comfort against the hard plastic of the door panel and the unyielding surface of the seat cushion. The laundromat's windows glowed like beacons in the darkness, fluorescent lights creating an aquarium effect that allowed me to watch people come and go throughout the night. Shift workers washing uniforms before heading home to apartments and houses I'd never see. College students doing laundry because their dormitory machines were broken. Elderly people who seemed to use the 24-hour business as much for social contact as for cleaning clothes. Each person who entered and left had somewhere to go afterward, somewhere that belonged to them, somewhere with doors that locked and beds that waited for their return. I had forfeited my membership in that basic human community, become one of the invisible people I'd passed on streets without really seeing. The nights were the worst part. During daylight hours, I could maintain the pretense of normalcy, could sit in libraries and coffee shops and blend in with people who had homes to return to when evening came. But when darkness fell and the world divided itself into those who had shelter and those who didn't, my exile from conventional society became impossible to ignore or disguise. I learned the rhythms of 24-hour businesses, discovering which gas stations had the cleanest restrooms and the most understanding staff. I found that some fast food restaurants would allow me to sit for hours nursing a cup of coffee if I chose my timing carefully and didn't attract attention to myself. I identified parking spots where a lone woman in a car wouldn't draw unwanted notice from police or predators. The days blurred together in a haze of job applications and careful resource management. I used public restrooms at gas stations and fast food restaurants, learning which locations had the cleanest facilities and the most understanding management. Some places posted signs discouraging loitering, but others seemed to recognize that people in desperate circumstances deserved basic human dignity. I discovered that libraries offered more than just free internet access. They provided private spaces where a woman could sit for hours without anyone questioning her right to be there, bathrooms with soap and paper towels, and an atmosphere of quiet respect that made me feel temporarily human again, rather than simply a problem to be managed or moved along. I applied for every position I could find that didn't require an address for contact purposes. Retail jobs that paid minimum wage but promised immediate income, cleaning services that required no experience but offered flexible scheduling, temporary positions that provided no benefits but might lead to something more permanent if I proved myself valuable enough to retain. My lack of a permanent address complicated every aspect of the job search process, forcing me to be creative about contact information and interview scheduling. Some employers were understanding when I explained my circumstances, while others seemed to view homelessness as evidence of character flaws that made me unsuitable for employment, regardless of my qualifications or work history. But in those quiet moments between the desperate scrambling for survival, when I sat in library reading rooms surrounded by books and the gentle whisper of turning pages, something else began to stir in the depths of my consciousness. A memory I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed, a secret I'd kept for so long it had become part of the architecture of my silence. I would catch myself staring at my reflection in bathroom mirrors, seeing not just the face of a woman worn down by circumstances, but glimpses of someone I used to be, someone who had dreams that extended beyond scanning groceries and surviving paycheck to paycheck, someone who had talents Ryan never knew about, never bothered to ask about, never thought to value. In the darkness of my car, surrounded by the soft sounds of a world settling into sleep, I would close my eyes and remember the girl who had filled notebooks with stories, who had won writing contests in high school, who had been accepted to journalism school before financial reality and family obligations had redirected her toward more practical pursuits. I remembered the acceptance letter I'd hidden in a shoebox for 23 years, along with the scholarship notification that would have made college possible. The dreams I'd folded away like winter clothes when Ryan entered my life and convinced me that love meant choosing security over ambition, stability over the uncertain path of following artistic inclinations. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. In that shoebox, beneath layers of mementos and faded photographs, lay evidence of a person I'd set aside, but never completely abandoned. And as I sat in that car, with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to fall, I began to understand that sometimes you have to lose everything to remember who you really are. The pain wasn't just pain anymore. It was becoming something else, something that felt like awakening rather than destruction. The weight that had been crushing me was starting to lift, not because my circumstances had improved, but because I was finally ready to stop carrying burdens that had never really been mine to bear. Ryan had taken everything he thought had value, but the most valuable thing I possessed was something he'd never even known existed, something that belonged entirely to me, untouched by his judgment, unmarked by his dismissal, waiting patiently for the moment when I would be brave enough to reclaim it. It wasn't pain anymore, it was clarity. 5 nights into my automotive housing situation, when the accumulation of stress and inadequate nutrition had pushed my body beyond its ability to function normally, I found myself standing in line at a potential employer's office, clutching yet another application form and trying to project the confidence that homeless people weren't supposed to possess, when the world tilted sideways and the floor rushed up to meet me with an inevitability that felt almost gentle compared to everything else. That had happened. When consciousness returned several hours later, I found myself in a hospital bed, surrounded by the antiseptic smells and steady electronic beeping that characterized medical facilities everywhere. A nurse with kind eyes and graying hair sat beside my bed, checking my chart with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen every form of human suffering and learned to treat each case with equal dignity. Her name tag read Claire, and something in her demeanor suggested she understood that healing involved more than just medical treatment. "Hello, honey," Claire said, her voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in weeks. "You gave us quite a scare. The paramedics said you collapsed from dehydration and exhaustion. When was the last time you had a proper meal?" The question should have been simple to answer, but I found myself struggling to remember when I'd last eaten something that qualified as actual nutrition rather than just temporary hunger suppression. Time had become fluid since my life fell apart, days distinguished only by whether I'd managed to earn enough spare change for a $1 menu item. "I'm not sure," I admitted, the words catching in my throat. "Maybe 3 days ago? There was a sandwich from somewhere?" Claire's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she'd heard similar stories before. "The doctor says your blood work shows severe dehydration and malnutrition. We're going to get some fluids into you and make sure you're stable before we discharge you." She adjusted something on the IV stand with gentle competence, then settled back into her chair with the unhurried manner of someone who understood that healing required time and attention rather than efficiency. "Is there someone I can call? Family member? Friend? Someone who should know you're here?" The question highlighted the completeness of my isolation in ways that made my current circumstances feel even more devastating. Ryan had been my emergency contact for everything, and his departure had left me without backup plans or support systems that most adults took for granted. "No," I said finally, the admission feeling like another small death. "There's no one." Claire nodded as if she'd expected this answer. "I understand. More than you might think." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a wrapped sandwich. "I used to be where you are. Different circumstances, but the same feeling of falling through cracks you didn't even know existed." Something in the nurse's tone suggested this wasn't just professional sympathy, and I found myself paying attention in a way I hadn't been able to focus on anything for weeks. Here was someone who'd survived whatever version of catastrophe life had thrown at her and emerged with enough compassion to sit with strangers in their darkest moments. "How?" I asked, the word barely a whisper. "How do you get out when everything you built just disappears?" Claire smiled, and it was the first genuine expression of hope I'd encountered since my world imploded. "One day at a time, one choice at a time, one person willing to help at a time." She handed me the sandwich. "Start with this. Tomorrow, we'll talk about what comes next." The sandwich was simple, peanut butter and jelly on white bread, but it tasted like salvation to someone whose body had been running on empty for days. As I ate, Claire told me about a church not far from the hospital that ran programs for women in crisis situations. "I'm not particularly religious myself," Claire explained with careful honesty, "but sometimes desperate circumstances require people to accept help from unexpected sources. The people there understand that crisis doesn't discriminate based on faith or moral worthiness. They don't preach at you. They don't require you to attend services or profess beliefs you don't hold. They just provide what you need to get back on your feet: shelter, food, job placement assistance, and dignity." Dignity. The word resonated with me in ways I couldn't articulate, touching something deep inside that had been damaged by weeks of feeling invisible and worthless. The church sat on a quiet corner in an older part of the city, its brick facade weathered but well-maintained, surrounded by mature trees that provided welcome shade and suggested the kind of permanence I'd lost faith in. A simple sign announced New Hope Community Church in letters that had faded but remained legible, and below that, "All are welcome." I hesitated at the entrance, fighting internal voices that insisted I didn't belong among people who had their lives together. But Claire's sandwich had been real, and her kindness had been genuine, and sometimes faith meant trusting in human goodness rather than divine intervention. The woman who greeted me introduced herself as Judy Martinez, coordinator of the church's assistance programs. She explained the services available to women who found themselves temporarily displaced, emphasizing that word, temporarily, as if she understood the psychological importance of framing homelessness as a condition rather than an identity. The shelter program operated out of a converted house adjacent to the church building, offering private rooms for up to 8 women at a time. The accommodations were basic but clean, with shared bathroom facilities and a kitchen where residents could prepare their own meals. More importantly, the program included job placement assistance, resume preparation, interview coaching, and the kind of practical support that people needed to transition from crisis back to stability. The room I was assigned was small but private, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto a garden where previous residents had planted flowers and vegetables. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, and someone had hung encouraging quotations in simple frames, words about perseverance and hope that might have seemed trite under other circumstances, but felt profoundly meaningful to someone who'd begun to doubt whether her situation could improve. That first night in an actual bed, between clean sheets, with a locked door between myself and the outside world, I slept more deeply than I had in weeks. But more than physical rest, I felt something stirring that I hadn't experienced since Ryan's voicemail had shattered my world. In the quiet safety of that small yellow room, surrounded by evidence that other women had survived circumstances similar to mine, I allowed myself to remember who I'd been before I became Mrs. Morrison, before I convinced myself that love meant diminishing my own dreams to make room for someone else's ambitions. I thought about the stories I used to write in high school, the characters who lived in my imagination and spoke through my pen with voices so clear they felt more real than the people around me. I remembered the thrill of seeing my name in print, When the school literary magazine published my work, the way my English teacher had pulled me aside to talk about my potential, the acceptance letter from the journalism program that I'd hidden away like a shameful secret. 23 years ago, I'd made a choice that seemed practical at the time. Ryan had offered stability, security, a life where I wouldn't have to worry about whether my writing was good enough to support me. He'd painted a picture of domestic contentment that appealed to a girl who'd grown up watching her parents struggle to make ends meet, who'd learned to value safety over uncertain dreams. But lying in that narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where previous residents had left faint pencil marks, maybe counting days until they could leave, or maybe just processing their own journeys back to stability, I understood with startling clarity that the choice hadn't been between security and uncertainty. It had been between living someone else's idea of my life and discovering what I was actually capable of achieving. Ryan had never asked about my writing. In 12 years of marriage, he'd never once expressed curiosity about the notebooks I sometimes filled during quiet Sunday afternoons, never wondered what I thought about during the long hours behind the cash register, never considered that the woman he'd married might have ambitions that extended beyond supporting his career advancement. He'd seen me as an accessory to his life rather than the protagonist of my own story, and I'd allowed that perception to shape how I saw myself, gradually forgetting that I'd once been someone with dreams worth pursuing. But dreams, I was learning, are remarkably resilient. They can be buried under years of compromise and self-doubt, hidden beneath layers of practical decisions and other people's expectations. But they don't actually die. They wait, with the patient persistence of seeds in winter soil, for the right conditions to emerge. In that small room, surrounded by yellow walls and borrowed hope, I began to feel those seeds stirring. Not just the memories of who I'd been, but the possibility of who I might still become. The woman who'd been discarded and dismissed was discovering that she'd been carrying her own rescue all along. Over the following weeks, Judy proved to be more than just an administrator. She became a mentor, teacher, and sometimes surrogate family member who understood that rebuilding a life required more than just providing shelter and meals. She helped me rewrite my resume to emphasize transferable skills rather than just job titles, taught me interview techniques that highlighted my reliability and experience rather than my recent employment gap. 18 years of customer service experience, Judy said, reviewing the updated resume with the attention of someone who understood that presentation mattered in ways that went beyond qualifications. That demonstrates loyalty, patience, communication skills, problem-solving ability. Any employer would be lucky to have someone with your background. She also provided something equally important, a daily routine that gave structure to days that had become shapeless and directionless during the worst period of my crisis. Morning coffee in the communal kitchen, job searching at the computer center the church maintained for residents, afternoon walks through the neighborhood that helped me remember what normal life looked like. The other women in the shelter became an unexpected source of strength and community. Despite coming from different backgrounds and experiencing different types of crisis, we shared an understanding of what it meant to have your life completely disrupted through circumstances largely beyond your control. There was Maria, whose husband's construction accident had left him disabled and their family unable to afford rent. Sarah, who'd fled an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and her 2 young children. Jennifer, whose small business had failed during an economic downturn. But it was during those quiet evening hours, when the shelter settled into its nighttime routine and I had privacy to think without the immediate pressures of job searching and survival planning, that I felt most clearly the stirring of something that had been dormant for too long. I began writing again, not with any grand plan or specific goal, but simply because the words demanded to be released after years of being held captive. I found an old composition notebook in the church's supply closet, its pages slightly yellowed but perfectly functional, and began filling it with observations, memories, and stories that emerged from some deep well I'd forgotten existed. At first, I wrote about my experiences, the grocery store customers who'd treated me with casual contempt, the moment I'd realized my marriage was over, the strange dignity I'd discovered in learning to sleep in my car. But gradually, the writing expanded beyond autobiography into fiction, creating characters who faced their own versions of abandonment and discovery. I wrote about a woman who inherited her grandmother's recipe collection and discovered handwritten notes that revealed family secrets spanning 3 generations. about a night shift nurse who found herself counseling patients through more than just medical crises, about a librarian who noticed patterns in the books people checked out that helped her solve mysteries in their personal lives. The stories seemed to pour out of me with an urgency that surprised me. After years of feeling creatively empty, of convincing myself that practical concerns had to take precedence over artistic impulses, I discovered that the creative part of my mind had been quietly developing all along, observing and cataloging experiences, waiting for the opportunity to transform observation into narrative. Judy noticed the notebook I carried everywhere, the way I would pause during conversations to jot down phrases or observations, the focused concentration that would settle over me during evening hours when other residents were watching television or talking on the phone. "You're a writer," she said one evening, not as a question but as a statement of recognition. "I wondered what you were working on so intently." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, embarrassed to be caught in what still felt like an indulgence rather than a legitimate pursuit. "It's nothing serious, just thoughts, stories." Judy settled into the chair across from me in the shelter's small common room, her expression serious but encouraging. "Would you be willing to share one?" I promised to give you an honest response. I hesitated, feeling the familiar fear of judgment that had kept my writing hidden for so many years. But something in Judy's demeanor suggested genuine interest rather than polite curiosity, and I found myself reading aloud from a story I'd written about an elderly man who left coded messages in library books for his deceased wife, believing she might somehow find them and understand he still loved her. When I finished, Judy sat quietly for several moments before speaking. "Rebecca," she said, using my full name in a way that felt formal and significant. "That's not just good writing. That's exceptional writing. That's the kind of story that stays with people, that makes them think about their own relationships and regrets." She leaned forward, her voice taking on the intensity of someone sharing important information. "There's a literary contest I think you should enter. It's sponsored by a magazine that publishes new voices, writers who haven't had much traditional exposure. The deadline is next month, and the winner receives $5,000 plus publication in their spring issue. $5,000. The amount was significant enough to represent a new beginning, but more than the money, the possibility of publication felt like validation of dreams I'd carried silently for so long. "I don't know," I said, uncertainty making my voice smaller than I'd intended. "I haven't written seriously in years. These are just practice pieces." "These aren't practice pieces," Judy corrected gently but firmly. "These are the work of someone who's been observing human nature and emotional truth for years, who's finally found the courage to translate those observations into art. You have something important to say, Rebecca, and you have the skill to say it beautifully." That night, I lay in my narrow bed reading through the notebook I'd filled over the previous weeks, seeing my own words with new eyes. The stories were rough, unpolished, but they contained something I hadn't expected to find, a voice that felt authentically mine, distinct from the influences that had shaped my earlier writing attempts. More than that, they contained perspectives that could only have emerged from the experiences I'd initially seen as purely destructive. The pain of Ryan's abandonment had taught me things about resilience I couldn't have learned any other way. The humiliation of homelessness had shown me depths of human dignity I'd never noticed before. The forced simplicity of living with almost nothing had clarified what actually mattered in ways that years of comfortable routine had obscured. The woman who'd been discarded for being insufficient had discovered talents her husband had never bothered to explore. The grocery store clerk who'd been seen as replaceable had been quietly developing skills that no employer could eliminate with a corporate restructuring. The middle-aged woman who'd been deemed too old and set in her ways to start over was proving capable of growth that surprised even her. Over the following days, I found myself writing with increasing confidence and clarity. The stories began to take on more sophisticated themes, exploring questions about identity, resilience, and the hidden strengths that emerge when external supports are stripped away. I wrote about characters who discovered that their greatest losses had prepared them for their most significant victories. But it was when I began working on the story I planned to submit to the contest that something shifted in a way I couldn't have anticipated. The narrative I was crafting seemed to be writing itself, flowing with a natural rhythm that felt both surprising and inevitable. The story was about a woman named Anna who worked in a small-town diner. watching the regular customers whose lives she'd observed for years without really understanding the quiet dramas unfolding over coffee and comfort food. When the diner faced closure due to economic pressures, Anna discovered that she'd been unconsciously collecting the stories of her community, and that her detailed observations had prepared her to become their chronicler in ways that preserved not just individual narratives but the social fabric of a place that was disappearing. As I wrote, I realized I wasn't just telling Anna's story. I was exploring my own relationship with observation, with the way 18 years of customer service had taught me to read human behavior and emotional subtext. The grocery store that had felt like a dead end was revealing itself to have been an education in human nature that no formal training could have provided. 3 days before the contest deadline, I finished the story and read it through completely for the first time. It was different from anything I'd written before, more confident, more complex, more willing to trust the reader's intelligence and emotional sophistication. But more than that, it was unmistakably mine, in a way that felt like coming home to a version of myself I'd lost track of years before. The voice that emerged from those pages belonged to someone who'd been shaped by difficulty but not broken by it, someone who'd learned to find meaning in experiences that others might dismiss as mundane or unfortunate. That evening, as I prepared the submission according to the contest guidelines, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, excitement about the future that wasn't based on desperation or survival needs, but on genuine anticipation of what I might be capable of achieving. I sealed the envelope containing my story and walked to the mailbox on the corner, my heart beating with a rhythm that felt like possibility rather than anxiety. As the envelope disappeared into the postal system that would carry it toward judges I'd never meet, I understood that regardless of the outcome, something fundamental had already changed. I was no longer the woman who'd been discarded. I was the woman who was just beginning to discover what she was truly worth. 6 weeks after I'd mailed my story to the literary contest, I'd almost forgotten about it. The daily routine of job searching and rebuilding my life had consumed most of my mental energy, and the contest had begun to feel like a distant dream rather than a realistic possibility. I'd submitted my writing to several smaller publications as well, receiving polite rejection letters that thanked me for my submission, but explained that my work wasn't quite what they were looking for at this time. Each rejection stung, but not in the devastating way I'd expected. Instead of confirming my fears about inadequacy, they felt like part of a necessary process, steps in learning how to navigate a world I was only beginning to understand. I was developing the resilience that comes from having already survived the worst thing you thought could happen to you. I'd found part-time work at a small independent bookstore downtown, shelving books and helping customers find exactly the story they didn't know they were looking for. The pay was modest, but it came with benefits I hadn't anticipated. Daily immersion in literature, conversations with people who valued books as more than just entertainment, and the quiet satisfaction of matching readers with writers whose work might change their perspective on their own lives. The bookstore's owner, a woman named Eleanor, who'd been running the shop for 30 years, had noticed my knowledge of contemporary fiction and my ability to recommend books based on subtle cues about what customers were really seeking. She'd begun trusting me with more responsibility, including writing the staff recommendation cards that helped guide browsers toward discoveries they might otherwise overlook. It was a Thursday afternoon, typically quiet except for the college students who used our comfortable reading chairs to study, when Eleanor called me to the front counter with unusual excitement in her voice. "Rebecca," she said, holding up a thick cream-colored envelope with my name written in formal calligraphy across the front. "This was just delivered by courier. It looks important." My hands trembled as I took the envelope, recognizing the return address of the literary magazine that had sponsored the contest. The weight of the paper suggested this was more than a standard rejection letter, but I'd learned not to interpret hope too confidently when experience had taught me that disappointment was often dressed in promising packaging. I retreated to the small office behind the fiction section, needing privacy to process whatever news the envelope contained. Eleanor had tactfully given me space, understanding without explanation that some moments require solitude. The letter inside was printed on the same heavy paper as the envelope, with letterhead that spoke of established literary tradition and serious artistic consideration. I read the first line 3 times before my mind could accept what my eyes were telling me. "Dear Ms. Morrison, we are delighted to inform you that your story, The Chronicler of Small Things, has been selected as the winner of our annual fiction contest. The words seemed to rearrange themselves on the page as I read them, meaning shifting and settling like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Winner. My story. $5,000. Publication in their spring issue, which would be distributed to bookstores and libraries across the country. But the letter continued with information that transformed victory into something even more significant. Your story so impressed our editorial board that we would like to discuss the possibility of developing a collection of your short fiction for publication. Our small press division specializes in emerging voices, and we believe your work represents exactly the kind of authentic, emotionally resonant writing that contemporary readers are seeking. A book. They were suggesting the possibility of an actual book, with my name on the cover, sitting on shelves in stores like the one where I worked. The idea seemed so far beyond anything I'd allowed myself to hope for that my first reaction was skeptical disbelief. I read the letter 5 times, each reading confirming details that seemed too good to be true. They wanted to meet with me next week to discuss terms and timeline. They'd already scheduled interviews with 2 literary magazines that were interested in featuring emerging contest winners. They believed my work had commercial potential that extended beyond literary publications into mainstream fiction markets. When I finally emerged from the office, Eleanor took one look at my face and immediately understood that something significant had occurred. "Good news?" she asked, her voice gentle but clearly curious. "I won," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "The contest. They want to publish my story. They're talking about a book." Eleanor's response surprised me. Instead of the polite congratulations I'd expected, her face lit up with genuine excitement and something that looked like vindication. "I knew it," she said, moving around the counter to give me a spontaneous hug. "I've been watching you recommend books to customers for months, seeing how you understand what makes a story matter to people. That kind of insight doesn't come from just reading literature. It comes from understanding human nature at a level most people never reach." That evening, I called Judy to share the news, and her reaction was even more emotional than I'd anticipated. "Rebecca," she said, her voice thick with what sounded like tears, "do you understand what this means? Not just the money, though $5,000 will certainly give you options you didn't have before. This means that your voice, your perspective, the things you learned during the worst period of your life, they matter. They're valuable not just to you, but to people you've never met who need to read exactly what you've written." For the first time since receiving the letter, I began to cry. Not tears of relief or gratitude, though I felt both of those emotions, but something deeper and more complex. I was mourning the years I'd spent believing that my thoughts and observations weren't worth sharing, grieving for the woman who'd convinced herself that practical considerations should always take precedence over creative expression. But more than grief, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was young enough to believe that anything was possible. Pure, uncomplicated pride in my own accomplishment. I'd created something that strangers had deemed worthy of recognition and publication. I'd taken the raw material of pain and transformation and shaped it into art that could reach across the isolation that separates one person's experience from another's. That night, I sat in my small yellow room and thought about Ryan, probably for the first time in weeks without anger or bitterness. I tried to imagine his reaction if he knew that the woman he'd discarded as insufficient had just won a prestigious literary contest. The woman whose dreams he'd never bothered to ask about had discovered she possessed talents he'd never suspected existed. But what surprised me was that I felt no desire for revenge or vindication. Ryan's judgment of my worth had been based on such a limited understanding of who I actually was that his opinion no longer carried any weight. He'd evaluated me according to criteria that had nothing to do with my actual value as a human being, and his departure had freed me to discover aspects of myself that might have remained buried forever if I'd continued trying to be the person he thought he wanted. The contest win was validation, but it wasn't the source of my worth. It was evidence of worth that had always existed, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Ryan hadn't diminished me by leaving. He'd simply removed himself from the possibility of sharing in discoveries I was making about my own capabilities. 3 days later, I took the train to the city for my meeting with the magazine's editors. I wore my best interview outfit, clothes I'd carefully preserved during the worst period of my crisis, because some part of me had maintained faith that someday I'd need them for opportunities I couldn't yet imagine. The magazine's offices were in a converted warehouse in a neighborhood where artists and writers had created a community around shared values of creative authenticity and intellectual curiosity. The walls were lined with framed covers of previous issues, featuring work by authors whose names I recognized from years of reading during quiet Sunday afternoons. The editor who'd written my acceptance letter turned out to be a woman about my age named Sarah Chen, who'd spent 15 years identifying and nurturing emerging literary voices. Her assistant brought coffee in ceramic mugs rather than disposable cups, a small detail that somehow conveyed respect for the creative process and the people who dedicated their lives to it. "Your story moved me in ways I hadn't expected," Sarah said, settling into a chair across from me in her office overlooking the street where people hurried past with the purposeful urgency of those pursuing their own versions of creative success. But what impressed me even more was the maturity of the voice. This doesn't read like someone just discovering they can write. This reads like someone who's been observing and understanding human nature for years, finally finding the confidence to share those insights. She was right, of course. The 18 years behind the grocery store register hadn't been time wasted. They'd been an education in human behavior that no classroom could have provided. Every customer who'd treated me with casual contempt had taught me something about dignity. Every person who'd shared their troubles while I scanned their groceries had shown me something about resilience. Every small interaction had been preparation for understanding the complexity of human motivations in ways that informed my fiction. "We'd like to offer you a contract for a collection," Sarah continued, sliding a folder across her desk. 10 to 12 interconnected stories exploring themes similar to what you've accomplished in The Chronicler of Small Things. We're thinking of calling it Invisible Histories. Stories about people whose inner lives are richer and more complex than the world assumes. As I walked back to the train station that evening, carrying a signed contract that guaranteed publication of my first book, I understood that this moment represented more than professional success. It was the completion of a transformation that had begun with Ryan's devastating voicemail, continued through the systematic destruction of everything I'd thought permanent, and culminated in the discovery of strengths I'd never known I possessed. I was no longer the woman who'd been abandoned. I was the woman who'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the opportunity to discover who you really are when everything you thought you were has been stripped away. 6 months later, I stood in the window of my own small apartment, watching the morning light filter through curtains I'd chosen myself, in colors that pleased no one but me. The space was modest, a one-bedroom unit above a bakery where the smell of fresh bread served as a daily reminder that simple pleasures could be profound when you'd learn to appreciate them properly. The advance from my book contract had been enough to secure this place, to buy furniture that suited my actual preferences, rather than someone else's idea of what our home should look like. Every item I'd chosen, the reading chair positioned to catch afternoon light, the small desk where I wrote in the early morning hours before the world demanded my attention, the bookshelf that housed both my favorite novels and the first printed copy of my own story, represented a choice made freely, without consideration of anyone else's approval or judgment. Eleanor had offered me full-time work at the bookstore, with health insurance and responsibilities that made use of my growing reputation as someone who understood what made stories matter to readers. My days were spent surrounded by literature, helping customers discover authors who might change their perspective, writing shelf recommendations that guided browsers toward books that could offer exactly the insight they didn't know they needed. But the mornings belonged entirely to me, dedicated to the collection of interconnected stories that would become invisible histories. The writing flowed with increasing confidence and clarity, each story exploring the hidden complexity of people whose lives others might dismiss as ordinary or unremarkable. I wrote about a night janitor in an office building who left encouraging notes for employees going through difficult periods, creating an anonymous support network that transformed the workplace culture. About a grocery store clerk who noticed patterns in customers' purchases that helped her identify people struggling with depression, loneliness, or family crises, and who found subtle ways to offer kindness without invading their privacy. About a middle-aged woman who discovered after her husband's abandonment that the creative dreams she'd set aside hadn't disappeared, they'd been quietly developing, preparing for the moment when she would be brave enough to claim them. The stories were fiction, but they drew on truths I'd learned during my own transformation. Each character faced their own version of being underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, and each discovered that their greatest perceived weaknesses were actually sources of unique strength. 3 weeks before my book's publication date, I received a phone call that I'd been expecting but still found emotionally challenging. "Becky?" The voice was familiar but changed, lacking the confidence that had once characterized every conversation. "It's Ryan. I heard about your book. Congratulations." The call had come through the bookstore's main number, since my personal information was unlisted. Eleanor had taken the call initially, then asked if I wanted to speak with him. I'd said yes, not out of any desire for reconciliation or closure, but out of curiosity about what kind of person calls their abandoned ex-wife to acknowledge success they'd played no role in achieving. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady in ways that surprised me. "How did you hear about it?" "There was an article in the city magazine about local writers to watch. Your photo was... You looked happy. Different. Good different." I said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch until he felt compelled to fill it. I wanted to say I was sorry about how I ended things. The voicemail was, "It was cruel. You didn't deserve that." His apology was accurate but incomplete, acknowledging the method of his departure without addressing the deeper betrayal of spending months planning his exit, while allowing me to remain unaware of our financial crisis. But I found I had no interest in educating him about the full scope of his failures, no energy to invest in making him understand damage he'd been able to inflict because I'd trusted him completely. "I appreciate you calling," I said, meaning it in the most literal sense. His acknowledgement mattered not because I needed his validation, but because it confirmed how completely our positions had reversed. "I hope you're well. Are you happy?" he asked, and something in his tone suggested the question was more complex than simple curiosity. "Yes," I said, the word carrying weight that surprised even me. "I'm happy in ways I didn't know were possible." After I hung up, Eleanor asked if I was okay, clearly concerned about how contact with my ex-husband might have affected my emotional equilibrium. "I'm fine," I told her, and realized it was perhaps the most truthful statement I'd made in years. Better than fine. It's strange. Talking to him felt like talking to someone from a previous life, someone who'd known a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. The woman Ryan had married had been someone who believed her worth was determined by other people's assessment of her value. She'd measured her success by her ability to support someone else's ambitions, her happiness by her capacity to make someone else comfortable, her identity by her usefulness in advancing goals that were never really her own. That woman had been real, and her pain had been legitimate, but she'd been built on foundations that couldn't support the weight of a fully realized human life. When those foundations collapsed, they'd revealed bedrock that was stronger and more authentic than anything that had been constructed on top of it. 2 weeks later, Invisible Histories was published to reviews that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. The critics praised what they called the collection's emotional honesty and mature understanding of human resilience. Book clubs began selecting it for discussion. Independent bookstores featured it in their recommendation displays. But the response that moved me most deeply came from readers who wrote letters describing how specific stories had helped them understand their own experiences of being underestimated or overlooked. A woman who'd worked as a hotel housekeeper for 20 years wrote that she'd never seen her observations about guests' private lives valued as insight worth sharing. A man who'd been laid off from a factory job described recognizing his own dignity in one of my characters who found meaning in work others considered menial. These letters confirmed what I'd hoped, but hadn't dared to assume, that the perspective I'd gained from my own journey from devastation to discovery could serve as a bridge for others navigating similar transformations. 6 months after publication, I was invited to speak at a conference for women who'd experienced major life transitions, divorce, career changes, family crises that had forced them to rebuild their understanding of who they were and what they were capable of achieving. Standing before an audience of 300 women, looking into faces that reflected various stages of the process I'd been through myself, I understood that my story had become part of something larger than personal success. The woman who was abandoned a 1.5 years ago thought her life was over, I told them. She believed that her worth was determined by someone else's willingness to keep her, that her dreams were selfish indulgences that practical adults had to set aside. But that woman had been carrying her own rescue all along, in the form of talents and insights she'd never been encouraged to develop, strengths she'd never been invited to exercise, dreams that had been dormant but never actually dead. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the opportunity to discover who you really are when everything you thought you were has been stripped away. Sometimes the people who abandon us are actually freeing us to become the people we were always meant to be. After my talk, women approached with their own stories of transformation, their own discoveries about resilience they hadn't known they possessed. Each conversation reminded me that what had felt like personal devastation had actually been preparation for something I couldn't have imagined when I was scanning groceries and accepting Ryan's assessment of my limitations. That evening, I returned to my small apartment above the bakery, to my chosen furniture and my morning writing routine, and my life built entirely according to my own values and preferences. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my reading chair with a new novel by an author I'd discovered through my work at the bookstore. As I read, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent and the anticipation of tomorrow's possibilities, I understood with perfect clarity that this was not just recovery from what Ryan had done to me. This was the life I'd been meant to live all along, finally freed from the constraints of someone else's narrow imagination about what I could achieve. The woman who'd been dismissed as insufficient had discovered she was actually extraordinary, just not in ways that everyone was equipped to recognize or appreciate. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by books and possibilities, and the gentle sounds of a neighborhood settling into evening, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete satisfaction with exactly who I was, exactly where I was, and exactly what I'd built from the ashes of what someone else had tried to destroy. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth, and sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming so completely yourself that the person who abandoned you becomes irrelevant to your happiness. The story ends here, but the life, the real life, the chosen life, the life built on authentic foundations, was just beginning.